Okay, we're going to get started.
Okay.
So good evening. My name is Kathy Schluter, and I'm a member of the Racial Diversity Team of the United Methodist Church of Whitefish Bay. Tonight, we will end our Racism in America speaker series with a discussion of Christianity and race by Pastors Matt Hadley and Dan Dick. Reverend Dr. Matt Hadley is a senior pastor of the United Methodist Church of Whitefish Bay. He received his Master's of Divinity degree with a special emphasis on pastoral care and counseling, and later his Doctor of Ministry degree in preaching from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Reverend Dan Dick is the Associate to the Bishop of the Wisconsin Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. He has served as a Director of Connectional Ministries and on the General Board of Church and Society for the conference, and participated in the revision and writing of the updated social principles that he will discuss tonight. He is also a nationally known speaker, teacher, and author. I'm also excited to announce that our church and society team will be offering a Zoom panel discussion on environmental justice on Thursday, May 13th at 7 p.m. The program will define environmental justice and explain the work of the Milwaukee Environmental Justice Lab at UW-Milwaukee. I will send out more information and a Zoom link for the event in my email to you on Monday, but it can also be found on the church's website. So now please join me in welcoming Pastors Matt Hadley and Dan Dick.
All right, so if you can all mute yourself, that would be awesome. We're gonna have time. Dan and I are gonna leave quite a bit of time to field any kind of questions that you may have after hearing what we have to say. But I have to start by saying, you know what? I'm a pretty white guy. I'm almost 50% Swedish and 50% English. And Dan, you look pretty white as well. There's no doubt about it. And so how would you respond to the challenge that two white guys are maybe not the right speakers for this series, to finish this series?
Well, that question has been asked to me by more than just you, Matt. It is, I think, important that we acknowledge the fact that in our church, a lot of the conversation about race for a very long time has been conducted by white males, often to the exclusion of other people. And what I'm hoping we begin to see is what you've modeled with this series in Whitefish Bay, and that is that we move away from thinking about an event like this to a process and the opening of a long-term conversation. We'll talk a little bit tonight about the systemic racism, both intentional and unintentional, that is part of our country and part of our church. And I think it is incredibly important for everyone to speak out about the issues of racism, of white supremacy, of racial justice. And I think too often we put a burden on Black, Indigenous, persons of color to be the ones to speak out against. And I really feel we need to stand shoulder to shoulder and all speak out in favor of true, equitable racial justice. So I think owning and acknowledging what's wrong in the system means that this conversation has to include everyone. And while having one evening where the two white guys kind of talk about race and the church, that can't be the whole story. And I'm hoping that we have opportunity to continue to broaden this conversation with everyone involved. I have been able to watch a couple of the videos. I've not been able to join you for all of these sessions. So Matt, it would be helpful to me if you would take just a couple minutes to highlight what you have seen as really valuable in this series and some of the things that you think have truly made this time worthwhile.
Absolutely. But let me back up. When you and I were talking, we were kind of throwing around the thing, you know, we're both white, straight, and middle class. And the question that you asked of me in that meeting was, are we a part of the problem or are we a part of the solution? And I didn't respond to that when you asked that question, but I think in my lifetime, sometimes knowingly and sometimes unknowingly, I have been both.
Yep.
I really probably have been. When I went to seminary, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. And when you are a Madisonian, you kind of think the world revolves around Madison, or at least the state revolves around Madison. And when you leave there, you realize not so much. But when I first got to DC, they really confronted me and all of us with our status as privileged, what white privilege is. And one of the things that's come out of these first 7 weeks has really kind of challenged some of us to think about that and what that means for us, what our obligations need to be. All of these videos, except for the very first one, are online, so you can watch them all. It's a shame that we don't have the very first one. We don't have the rights to it. But our first 2 weeks were spent doing the history behind this. And Reggie Jackson got us started with just a historical look at how we got here. And it's hundreds of years of history that got us to this point. But we also took a historical look of moving from Jim Brown to Jim Crow. And then we looked at all the different ways in which racism can impact our society: employment barriers, educational debt, restorative health equity, fair housing, and then just the different shakes that happens within our criminal justice system. And so to me, the ones that really spoke the most were the historical, how we got here. Kathy said in my master's, I had an emphasis in pastoral care and counseling, but I also won a commencement award, which, if you know me academically, I have never won a commencement award until my master's degree in the history of Christianity. Just to take a look at that. So how we got here is important. And of course, as a person who has a bachelor's degree in education, our educational debt and the widening gap in terms of the quality of education that our children are receiving, that really spoke to me. But so we're going to get started, and we're going to take a look at a bunch of stuff. I wrote a teaser for Kathy because she wanted something she could put out. And I referenced 2 scriptures, one from the Old Testament, one from the New. The Old Testament was that the temple was supposed to be a house of prayer for all people. All people. God intended for everyone to be there. And when the Apostle Paul was writing, he basically said, we're all one in Christ Jesus. And so I kind of lamented in that teaser that you would think that the church that I had been a part of, my own expression of Christianity, but Christianity as a whole, would have been at the forefront to really bring into reality the inclusive nature of what Jesus came to bring, what his message was. And yet, I think the Christian church needs to continue to repent of the ways in which we have fallen short of really living into reality this inclusive love that God has to offer. And so when I think of my own experience, and I know not everyone on this Zoom call is a United Methodist, but I've been a lifelong United Methodist. And there was a time in our country's history where Methodism was the largest body, Christian body, in the New World, in America, even during the times where some of the most horrific things were happening. But it's still our current reality. And it's not just Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians. We all have fallen short of this reality to what God calls us to. Dan, you asked what really stayed with me. When Brady Henderson did the speech from Jim Brown to Jim Crow, he showed us some deeply disturbing images of entire counties coming out to witness and to cheer lynchings and other horrible things. And there are written accounts that pastors cut their sermons short on the day of lynchings so that the flock could be out there to cheer it on. These are people who say, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. I believe in the love and grace of God for all. And yet there they are wanting to get out of church early so they can witness this horror. And so every denomination, every expression of Christianity is guilty of this. But I am a part of the United Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church. But we are far, far away from being united. In fact, we are fractured now, but really we're just reliving out our history as a body of Christ. If you go through history, you get phrases like the Methodist Episcopal, the Methodist Protestant, the Methodist Episcopal South, the Methodist Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the colored is what it was originally called, the colored Methodist Episcopal Church. And the founder of this whole movement was a man named John Wesley. And John Wesley lived a really long life, given life expectancy in the 1700s. He basically lived the entire 1700s, the entire 18th century, born in 1703 and dying in 1798. And as an aside, he lived at a time in history where there was no inflation, basically, when he lived. Can you imagine that? I mean, what did you pay for gas when you first filled up your tank? Inflation is a reality now. But he was a part of the Church of England, and there was this movement of people wanting to get to the New World, wanting to get away from a state-owned church. And so our expression of faith really was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1784. And when I was serving out there, I was able to take confirmation classes to Lovely Lane Church and talk about the history and show it to them right there. But it did not take long for matters of race to divide us. And we know that in 1844, there was this split. And the split was basically North and South, the Methodist Episcopal and the Methodist Episcopal South. So as a long-haired 24-year-old, I was appointed to my very first church as the solo pastor, right on the district line. It was St. Paul's United Methodist Church. And when I arrived, there was this beautiful stained glass window above the front door, right underneath the steeple. And it said, St. Paul, Methodist Episcopal South. It was a white flight congregation. They actually had photographs of every pastor that had ever been there, and it was a long line of white old guys. But when my first Sunday came, I was amazed that my wife and I were 40% of the Caucasian attendees. It had become a completely Black congregation. And you think when I say Black, African American, the majority were African. Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Malawi, but there was also the Caribbean islands, Dominica, Jamaica. It was just a beautiful, diverse community of faith. So I find some irony there. The founders of that church would have rolled over when they moved out of downtown DC to get away from those people, to move just as the crow flies 6 miles north. And now it was almost a completely Black congregation. That congregation's history, the United Methodist Church in the South's history, was about racism. And it's still an ugly reality, both North and South. And so this past year, I had never heard of Zoom until March of last year. And now my whole life is Zoom. So that's something new, but sadly, racism is something that we have all seen, and we've seen it way too often. And depending on your age and your ideology, you might be saying, well, here we go again. It's as ugly now as it has ever been inside the church and outside of the church. And what I think we need to acknowledge is that any person of any color in any country in the world is capable of racism. Everyone is capable of racism. But our focus today is white Christianity, this understanding of white supremacy, and with it comes racism. And as I've been studying and preaching some sermons that have made some of my congregation very uncomfortable, have had others of them really say amen. There's a generational reality to racism. Racism is taught. In many ways, racism can be a learned behavior. The Bible in the Old Testament talks about sins being passed down from generation to generation. And so these attitudes, this sin is passed down. It is fostered and encouraged by families and by systemic social structures, such as schools and, unfortunately, churches. Most white churches continue to serve, consciously or not, as mechanisms of transmitting and reinforcing white supremacist attitudes among new generations. And sometimes white churches don't even know they're doing it, right? They don't even know what their actions, what their statements, where their mission dollars go or don't go, the kind of statement that makes. And so racism, I believe, is a sin, and it's a sin the church needs to repent of. But we know if you grew up in a racist home or a racist church, unless you are willing to be that one generation that says enough is enough, it is going to continue down through generation after generation. And so, yes, racism is alive in the USA. We're not an ostrich with our head in the sand. We understand, we see it. And so one of the little kind of cliche quotes that I refuse to allow enter into the cliche status is, even the least racist is still a racist. And you can find them mathematically as much in the church as you do outside of the church. And so I preached a sermon once. We had the Zeidler group come, and we had an entire congregation-wide event to really talk about matters of race. And in the sermon, I kind of began, because you want to begin with something light, right? As a preacher, that's kind of, we want to get people in. I told a story about a man who took his full-grown dog to the veterinarian and asked the veterinarian to cut that dog's tail off, the entire tail. And so maybe some of you who are a part of my community of faith remember this story. And the vet said, "What? Why? And why completely?" Well, the guy who owned the dog said, "Well, my mother-in-law is coming to visit us, and I don't want anything in the house to suggest that she is welcome." Didn't want that tail to wag at all. And so we know the reality is we don't want certain people in our home. But a convicting question is that the same for truth, for church, our church home? Has the church, the Christian church, not just the Methodist church, have we in some way systematically cut the tail off of the dog? And so in that sermon, I introduced 3 Greek words, and I'm positive I go to the biblical Greek way more than my congregation is comfortable with. I sometimes say I'm a Greek geek when it comes to those kinds of matters. But there's 3 Greek words, 2 of which have been thrown around over the last 5 years quite a bit, and people don't even know really the Greek understanding of it. The first word is xenos. And do we know what xenos means? It means stranger, foreigner, the other, and enemy. The second Greek word is phobia, which means an extreme or irrational fear or aversion to something. The third is filio or philia, which means love, often referred to brotherly love or sibling love, or not just sibling love, but the love you have for a dear friend. It is an outpouring of love. It is benevolent. It is a kindly love. Our culture, not just in the last 5 or 6 years, but over the last 200 plus years, is all too familiar with that phrase, xenophobia, the fear or hatred of strangers, of foreigners, or anything that is different than who we are. And so if we're white, anyone who is not, and this goes deeper than just black or white, it is other, we have this fear or hatred. But the Bible speaks to it. The Bible takes that word xenos And it changes it and says filio xenos, which really means to love the stranger, to love in the name of Christ, the foreigner, or even, and we hate it when Jesus said this, we kind of wish he didn't, even our enemies. He calls us to love, filio xenos. And so as I reflected, and as I reflect currently, this is at the heart of the life and the message that Jesus lived and calls us to follow. And every church that has a mission statement, their mission statement really is all about filio xenos, but is it lived out in reality? Is it lived out in practice? I mean, how are we doing? We say on earth as it is in heaven, but are we really loving people here on earth the way we're called to love each other as in heaven? I have a lot of kind of spiritual giants that I like to read devotions from. Our church is doing a Nowin book study this Lenten season, but Thomas Merton, and he shares a story. He was in Louisville, and he was just looking at all the people going around, and he was acknowledging how different so many people were from him, and then God got a hold of him. Isn't it scary when God gets a hold of you because you are convicted completely? And so this encounter with the quote unquote other suddenly opened his eyes. And this is what he wrote. I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people. Filio xenos, that they were mine and I was theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts, the depth of their hearts, where neither sin nor desire nor self-knowledge can reach, the core of their reality, the person that each one is in God's eyes. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. Then he reflected, then there would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed. So let's go back to our Methodist history. So we split in 1844. Do we know what was going on in 1844? We were about to go to war in this country, North versus South, over the right for human dignity, basically, over slavery. And the tipping point for some of the Methodists in the North was the Bishop of Georgia. His name was James Osgood Andrew, and he was elected a bishop in the Methodist Episcopal Church, which was all of Methodism at that time. But there was a problem. He inherited slaves. He had slaves, and he was not going to liberate them. Now, some people have argued, no, but he was a very kind slave owner. He did all these things, but he was a slave owner. And so the church split. And after the church split, he was still a bishop, but in the Methodist Episcopal South. And so there were a lot of people within the Methodist world that were starting to just bail. They went off, including the Methodist Protestants. And so when I took my second church, which was a very, very large church in a blue collar community, a suburb of Baltimore, I was just one of the pastors on staff. The first day I walked into that church, their stained glass window said, Glen Burnie Methodist Protestant Church. And actually the seminary that I graduated from in DC started out up north in Maryland as the Methodist Protestant Seminary, that history. And so our church was splitting, but all churches were kind of splitting and fracturing over slavery. And those in the North, you know, kind of would say, well, that's a way of life for the Southern states. The people in the South were saying, this is a way for us to live in the South. And the sermons that they were hearing in their churches did nothing but help this. And so we think this is something that happened years and years and years ago, right? But it's really still very close to us. The last person, a man by the name of Sylvester McGee, that was born as a slave, lived until 1971. But maybe some of you remember this. You remember the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2000. And 16. There was a woman there, and her name was Ruth Odom Bonner, who was the last known child born to parents that had been completely enslaved. And I'm told, I read this week with a book that somebody from the congregation gave me, that in that museum, there was, at least at some point in time, one of only 3 existing copies of something called the Slave Bible. Has anyone ever heard of the Slave Bible? And the title page read this: "Parts of the Holy Bible selected for the use of the Negro slaves in the British West India Islands." And it was constructed to help white Christian missionaries who were going, to try and talk to these people. It gave them what they needed to emphasize the passages that were demanding some things: obedience to the masters. And it excluded every part of the Bible that even had a hint of equality or liberation. They've gone through it. 90% of the Old Testament is out, and half of the New Testament was left out. This Slave Bible. And you flash forward, hundreds of years, Howard Thurman, the great Howard Thurman, who was a professor at Boston University. He was the main teacher for Dr. King when he was at Boston getting his PhD. He wrote a little book called Jesus and the Disinherited, which was one of 2 books that Dr. King kept in his briefcase, or one of 3 books he kept in his briefcase at all times. That one, Gandhi's Principles of Nonviolent Resistance, and the Holy Bible. But Howard Thurman told a story once that his grandmother would slap him if she ever heard him reciting any of the Apostle Paul's writings, St. Paul, because he seemed to advocate for slavery. And so a lot of people have said, well, if John Wesley was our founder, where did he fall down on this slave trade, on what slavery should be? And I read an article a week ago called John Wesley and Slavery, Myth and Reality, by a guy named Irv Brendlinger. And he really says that there's nowhere in any of Wesley's writings or preaching that said he supported slavery. Although he doesn't really hit it head on until he was 69 years old, which when he was alive, he had outlived most of his contemporaries by that time. But this is what he wrote. I think this is great. It's not that it was a new conviction that slavery was wrong, but probably a new awareness that he could do something about it, that he felt he must do something about it. Wesley vehemently opposed the slave trade. Some of his heartiest epithets were used in referring to those in the trade, and he called them men butchers, which I never met Wesley, obviously, but I would imagine that was about as naughty as ever talked about anyone at that time. And so there was a myth that was around during this slave trade time, that Africans are at least in need of the light of the gospel, and at most were created to be a servile class in the chain of being. But that was not Wesley's belief. The founder of the church that I have given my life to, he really advocated that Africans, like all persons, no matter where you're from, no matter what the color of your skin, are in need of the light of the gospel. But that requires the sending of missionaries, not enslaving, which demonstrates the opposite of the gospel of love. Africans are fully human and not inferior to Europeans. As such, they deserve full liberty immediately. Those are strong words for a man whose movement came across the pond and suddenly morphed into something that believed it was their God-given right to own people. And so a lot of good church people tried to resist this. My father's family, my great-grandfather, I'm a baby of babies of babies. There's like 3 generations of oops babies in my family. But my great-grandfather was a Quaker in southern Indiana, just north of the Ohio River, and they were a stop on the Underground Railroad. But it was not enough. People like Frederick Douglass really said white Christian convictions about the evils of slavery more often than not failed to translate into strong commitments to Black equality. Yes, we think it's wrong that anyone should be property, but you still have a lower status in society than we do. America's Christianity's theological core had thoroughly been structured as Robert Jones says in this book, White Too Long, which is a good read. There's our progressive Christianity class at our church has been reading this. They were adamant that I read it before giving this presentation. It's a great book. And also C.C. Gowen's Broken Churches, Broken Nation. He said, that really what has been at the forefront of people inside the church has been promoting and protecting white supremacy. And so even when the Methodist Church came back together in 1939, no longer North or South, it is now we are the Methodist Church, there were still exclusions. There were still exclusions. And so let me just stop here and say, for those of us who were born in the North, who are raised in the North, and who are currently living in the North, there's this temptation to think that this was just a Southern problem. By no means is this just a Southern problem. As Jones says, it's not a matter of the bad, bad South and the good, good North. So this is what he wrote. While they disagreed about slavery, both Southern and Northern Methodists agreed that Black Methodists should hold a subservient place, not just in society, but even in Christian fellowship. Even after the Southern and Northern branches of Methodists reunited in 1939, they refused to integrate Black Methodists into their existing regional jurisdictions. Instead, they kept them aside. They created something called the central jurisdiction. And what that did was it kept them from having any influence in terms of what the denominational stances were going to be on anything. It wasn't until 1968, the year I was born. I'm as old, I'm 53 years of United Methodism, and here I am. It wasn't until 1968 that we kind of had one umbrella, but that umbrella has still been fractured. You know what happens when you have a great umbrella, even like a really fancy golf umbrella, and you come across a wind just like what we have today? It breaks. It breaks. And the winds of racism, the winds of white supremacy have broken that. And so we have been fractured, the sin of white supremacy in the church. And, and anytime I preach like this, I still receive kind of vicious emails and calls. White privilege. The last time I used that phrase in a sermon, I had a really intense phone call from a member of the church that said, I'm white, but I'm not privileged. Well, I've been to that member's house. It looks like a house of privilege. And this white person, no doubt, has never been looked at twice in a grocery store or a supermarket or a Walgreens. No one's ever wanted to ask to check that person's pockets. And so we still have a lot of work to go. This white supremacists. And I kind of believe that white supremacists are really hurting mainline progressive churches from growing because we all get lumped in. What we see in our society right now is prosperity gospel preaching instead of liberation gospel preaching. We see personal piety gospel preaching instead of social gospel preaching. And I really believe I lean towards the liberation and social side of things. I am a very progressive evangelical, but you're almost afraid to use that phrase evangelical because I really want to introduce people into a relationship with God, but I want people to understand that it's more than just you and God, it's you, God, and all of your brothers and sisters of every walk of life that we are called to love and to love completely. I read the prophet Micah very seriously. What does the Lord require? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. right in the midst of all of the racial tension, all the images that we were seeing of the deaths and the killings and the court hearings. I'm a subscriber to Christian Century, and I forget what month it was, but Dorothy Sanders Wells, an African-American serving a church in Tennessee, wrote an article, and she said, there seems to be some inherent dangers to living life as a person of color in the United States. Perhaps those dangers have their origin of the days when it was legal for Black people to be disciplined, lynched, and reminded that we are a lower place in society. And friends, we have always had a system of systemic injustice in this country, and not just towards people of African descent. How long was it before women had the right to vote? What did we do to Asian Americans in World War II, internment camps? I was asked to do the funeral for my favorite uncle, and he was wounded in World War II and came back, but was still serving. And he thought, my congregation's heard this before, he thought he was just building barracks for soldiers to come and train. He did not realize he was building the barracks for the internment camps. And he did not want any mention of his military service at his funeral, because he still carried around the weight of what he believed was a systemic sin. And that's too bad. Some of my favorite funerals are the really touching services where we have the 21 gun salute, we hear the blaring of the taps, how quiet it is when the flag is rolled up and presented to, whether it's the widow or the oldest remaining child. That we have a long history of systemic injustice that goes far beyond just matters of Black and white. And so working for justice is God's given task to us, especially those of us that call ourselves Christian. Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And so one of the things that Jones said in his book that I think is poetic, and it's not a quote, it's his. He said, white Christian churches composed, and I'm a musician, white Christian churches composed the cultural score that made white supremacy sing. I just love that quote, inside the church and outside the church. And so, political leaders with agendas, that's as old as time. Right at the height of the civil rights movement, the guy who won the governorship of Mississippi won by giving speeches that said God was the original segregationist and the Negro is different because God made them different in order to punish them. That's something that we cannot repent from enough. And so I want to end you with my time with a question for you to think about, to walk with, to disturb you. The question is this: if white supremacy was an unquestionable cultural assumption in America, what does it mean that Christian doctrines, by necessity, had to develop in ways that were compatible with that worldview? That's a heavy question to walk with. And so I'm going to hand the baton to Dan, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have at the end of this presentation.
Thank you, Matt. And thanks to all of you again for this opportunity to be with you tonight. This is something that I am deeply passionate about. I will bridge to Matt's comments to say, for years, I have called myself a progressive evangelical, which just confuses the daylights out of people. They don't know what to make of that in this day and age. And I also want to pick up on and talk about systemic racism and from a systems perspective. That's kind of my background before I entered seminary and became a pastor. Systems theory. Our country is a system. Our church is a system, and systems are designed. And systems are designed for particular purposes and to produce specific outcomes. And the Methodist Church and today's United Methodist Church, which also includes the traditions of the Evangelical Association and the United Brethren in Christ from our history. All three of these systems were systems designed and created by older, white, straight, male men of means to benefit themselves. Basically, a system is designed to benefit. And those who benefit from a system generally don't see any reason to change it. There's not a whole lot of reason to mess with it. And there's also generally not an excitement about having other people use their system. And so just a couple analogies to kind of put this in perspective before we talk specifically about our own United Methodist Church and what does the United Methodist say about racism and what does it call us to do. If you want to bake a cake, I hope you won't try to do that in a clothes dryer because that won't work. The system is not designed. The dryer system is not designed to bake cakes. And so when you try to use a system for something other than what it was designed for, it doesn't work very well. The second system analogy that I think we can mostly relate to would be the automobile and the gasoline engine. If you put gasoline in an engine, the engine should work pretty well. But if you should take that gasoline engine and put kerosene or diesel fuel in that, it might run for a time, but not very well, and it would soon break down. If you think, hey, I've got a good engine here, let me put some fine wine or champagne through it. That ought to really improve it. It won't work at all. And so a system is designed to run on a particular fuel. And our church system has been designed. The theology, our theology of Methodism has been predominantly designed by white men. Our hymnody, the core of our hymnody, has been predominantly designed by white men. Our doctrine and polity through our history has predominantly been designed by white men for a system that supports white males. And it's important just to own that and to understand that. Now, when we went through, I just read something the other day that I thought was interesting. And there's a lot of debate today about how much racial inequality we have, both in our country as well as in our church. And I saw this article, and I just want to share this before I shift gears directly to the United Methodist Church. Back last summer, when our country was really being shaken up through all of the images and all of the things following Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, the George Floyd killing, and the Jacob Blake shooting, there was a quote by Alabama Governor Kay Ivey, who was asked to really kind of share her thinking on racial inequality. And Governor Ivey said, "We're making too much of this. In this day and age, we're all running the same race, and it's the same finish line for all of us." Now, a couple students, one at Columbia University and one at Yale University, took up that analogy of race, of running a race, and played it out mathematically to a conclusion that I think is important for us to accept. They said, basically, if you agree that we all have the same finish line, let's look at the starting line. Because if whites in this culture want to run a marathon, they're going to run 26.3 miles. Now, I looked at the formula. I didn't understand the math, but just get the gist of what they're saying. If you're an Asian or an Asian American in this country, your starting line isn't 26 miles back, it's 34 miles back. If you're a non-Mexican, Hispanic, Latino running this race, your starting line is 56 miles from the finish line. If you're a Mexican or a Mexican American, your starting point is 67 miles away from the finish line. And if you're African American, Black in this country, your starting line is 81 miles away from the finish line. And so their analogy was to say also, one of the things they said is, and if you're a woman, add 10% more to the distance that you would be expected to run to compete in the race. And the conclusion they say is, folks, if you give somebody a 55-mile head start on a 26-mile race, you're never going to catch up and win that race. And that's part of what we're talking about with the inequities and the systemic change. Now, I'm going to share my screen and put up some slides, and I will make sure that these things are available to you. Whoops, and I went far away. So what I'm going to do is introduce you or reintroduce you to the United Methodist Church. And a lot of times people will come and say, well, what does the United Methodist believe about this? What does the United Methodist believe about race and racism and white privilege? We're going to touch on some of those things today. And so first I want to talk about, there is a book, once again, a creation of predominantly white, male, educated men. I guess most males are men. And we have in our church a book of discipline, which there are some among us who think that that book of discipline is a part of a 2-volume set with the Holy Bible, but I want to give preference to the Bible. But this lays out the doctrine and polity and how to run a local church and how to run an annual conference and how to run the denomination. And it has all kinds of instructions and rules and the policies for ordination and credentialing our leadership, for the different categories of licensed local pastors and deacons and elders. It has all of the different structural information. But the opening part of our book of discipline, the first 125 pages or so, actually lay out our history, our the articles of religion, what our church was founded on, our theological task, why we exist. And then there's a section called our social principles. And our social principles were developed following the formation of the United Methodist Church in 1968. And these are a set of the explanation. What are the core principles that we have derived through our reading of Scripture, our interpretation of Scripture, our theological basis that define for the world, what does it mean to be United Methodist? I'm going to look at the social principles and talk through those this evening. And then I want to end my time talking about a couple of things. One is in 2020, our bishops launched an initiative to dismantle racism. And the initial response to that was, that sounds great, but what does it mean? And so I'm going to try to spend a few minutes talking about what that means and what the bishops are looking to do through their effort to dismantle racism. And then I want to talk a little bit about racism and the global United Methodist Church, because the way we are dealing with it and how it affects us is not exactly the same as it affects everyone else around the planet. So in our book of discipline, paragraph 162 and the pieces that follow paragraph 162 are entitled The Social Community. I promise you, I am not going to read to you the entire book of discipline, but there are a few statements that I think are important to read in their entirety. So I ask your patience, simply because they really do lay out a statement of the United Methodist position on certain things. And so the introductory paragraph for the social community reads, "The rights and privileges a society bestows upon or withholds from those who comprise it indicate the relative esteem in which that society holds particular persons and groups of persons. We affirm all persons are as equally valuable in the sight of God. We therefore work towards societies in which each person's value is recognized, maintained, and strengthened. We support the basic rights of all persons to equal access to housing, education, communication, employment, medical care, legal redress for grievances, and physical protection. We deplore acts of hate or violence against groups or persons based on race, color, national origin, ethnicity, age, gender, disability, status, economic condition, sexual orientation, gender identity, or religious affiliation. Our respect for the inherent dignity of all persons leads us to call for the recognition, protection, and implementation of the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so that communities and individuals may claim and enjoy their universal, indivisible, and inalienable rights." That is classic Metho speak. There's nothing in there that isn't worth hearing and valuing. And yet, oh my goodness, we can use so many words to say simple things. And yet, that is the core of the Methodist view of human beings. We are all of equal worth. The next paragraph, or section of paragraph 162, is entitled "The Rights of Racial and Ethnic Persons." And again, I just want to read you two shorter segments. "Racism is the combination of the power to dominate by one race over other races and a value system that assumes that the dominant race is innately superior to the others. Racism includes both personal and institutional racism. Personal racism is manifested through the individual expressions, attitudes, and/or behaviors that accept the assumptions of a racial value system, a racist value system, and that maintain the benefits of that system. Institutional racism is the established social pattern that supports implicitly or explicitly the racist value system. We recognize racism as sin and affirm the ultimate and temporal worth of all persons. We rejoice in the gifts that particular ethnic histories and cultures bring to our total life. We commit as the church to move beyond symbolic expressions and representative models that do not challenge unjust systems of power and access. So what I want to lift up there is often people will say, well, I hear people say racism and racist, but I don't know exactly what the definition is. At least for our United Methodist Church, we have a statement of what we believe racism, both individual and institutional racism is. And just to summarize, as United Methodists, we think racism is bad. But not just thinking it's bad. We're called to respond to racism. Now, every 4 years when the General Conference meets, if you've ever heard of our General Conference, that is a gathering where we come together to edit and update and refine our book of discipline and to present legislation to the global denomination on how we will live out these principles. So to say that we embrace the rights of racial and ethnic persons, what does that mean? What does that look like at the local church level? Well, the work of the General Conference produces both the Book of Discipline, but that's part of a 2-volume set. And the other volume is not the Holy Bible. It's a book called the Book of Resolutions, And each of these resolutions are ways to enact the social principles. And so the Book of Resolutions is organized around those social principles. And there are a series of statements numbered about race in the Methodist Church. And so I'm not going to go into these in great detail. I'm going to tell you what the focus is only, and encourage you to find a copy of the Book of Resolutions. There should be a couple laying around your church somewhere. Someone should be able to find them for you. But number 3371 is a charter for racial justice in an independent global community. This was first, the Charter for Racial Justice was first created as a collaborative effort between our Commission on Religion and Race and our United Methodist Women back in 1972. It has been updated, modified, and readopted or ratified every 4 years since 1972. And it has basically a clear statement that United Methodists will do everything in their power to work for racial justice in their communities, in their states, in the country, and around the world. And so one of the roles of a commission on religion and race is to look at these resolutions and to help a conference. All the churches in Wisconsin are part of the Wisconsin Conference, to say, well, how are you doing with that? How well is that going? And that doesn't always work. In a system that is predominantly designed to support white leadership and white congregations, we have not done a very good job of monitoring how well we relate to other races and other ethnicities. So continuing this, the Methodist Church has a statement on affirmative action. Now, one of the sad realities for my life, and Matt was talking about, his lifespan has been the United Methodist Church. In 1968, when we first formed the United Methodist Church, most of these issues about racial justice and racial equality were considered human rights issues. But over that 50 plus years, these have shifted from human rights issues to becoming political issues. And so much of what to politicize some of these things has made it really difficult to have conversations. Affirmative action is one of those things where too often it has resulted in some tokenism, in some unfair practices, in some, I would say, inappropriate definitions. But United Methodism says that what we want to do is make sure that every person has an opportunity to find meaningful work is just and fair, and that no one should be discriminated against for employment purposes based on the color of their skin. And we have some very strong statements that I would encourage you to look and see what the church feels about that. 3374 says that annual conferences, districts, and local churches all have a responsibility to eradicate racism. Not just to oppose it, not just to think it's a bad thing, but to work together for the eradication of racism. And you will note that each of these in the legislation recommends that there be training and education and annual focus on how to work against these things. 3375 talks about membership in organizations that practice exclusivity is the word it uses, but that are racist. And I have been to at least 4 general conferences where it has been, legislation has come forward and it's always been defeated, that pastors who engage in racist organizations, that should be considered a chargeable offense where they could be removed from ministry. And every time that has come up, that has been defeated. And over the last year, through some of the things that have happened in this country, we know for a fact that Currently, today in 2021, we have 16 pastors nationwide who are members of the Ku Klux Klan. We know we have 3 pastors who are members of the Proud Boys. We know we have 3 pastors who have aligned with white supremacist groups, and they're all male. Surprise, surprise. But there is no recourse in the system to say, no, if you're going to be a racist and align with a supremacist group, you can't continue to be a pastor in our church. And so that's one of the evidences that of where we are. I want to move along a little bit quickly. There is a statement on white privilege in the United States and what it means to benefit from white privilege. There is a statement on opposition to racial profiling in the United States and racism, economic injustice against people of color in the US, and stop criminalizing communities of color in the US. I won't go into details. I will just say that we have very clear positions against those things. And you've had wonderful sessions that have focused on some of these very issues. And these are still critical issues where the church has had a position for a long time, but how have we really done? And I'm going to do a quick report card here. And then if you really disagree with my assessment and you think I'm being too bleak, great. That's an encouragement for you to get a book of resolutions and read through here and see what grade you would give instead of my grading. Because that charter on racism and racial discrimination, it's a wonderful statement, but there's virtually no accountability to see that it is in place. And what we did a survey a few years ago that found that only 13% of United Methodists even knew it existed, even knew that statement was there. Affirmative action, we've done a much better job within the church of moving beyond a tokenism into making sure that we have really strong leadership of a wide variety of racial and ethnic people in our local churches, in our districts, in our conferences, and across the denomination. As far as the eradication and the commitment of our local churches, districts, and annual conferences, I think we've done about a D. We've talked about it, but we haven't really done it widespread. There are some pockets, and you can point to some examples of churches that have done a wonderful job. The exclusive organizations, as I say, if we have pastors that are part of the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist movements, you can't say that we're doing a good job of avoiding our exclusive. The white privilege. Matt did a wonderful job of saying so many of the things about white privilege are we don't understand that they're privileges because we've never been denied them. We have always had them and have benefited. It's important for us to talk to people who don't benefit from them to see just how many benefits we have. And on the others, I would say we're doing really a poor job with our work against profiling for economic justice and the criminalization. Just very quickly, and I'll put all 4 of these up. Brian Stevenson, if you have not heard of him, he has done some wonderful videos. He has a couple wonderful books. There is a wonderful movie that was based on his work in the legal system and the criminalization. He talks about the power of proximity. And so he has worked with our Council of Bishops to say, instead of avoiding these issues just because they're uncomfortable, just because they're painful, we need to lean into these things. We need to pay attention to the pain and the harm that has been done and really understand the impact of our church system. We need to create spaces for people to tell their stories. And instead of expecting to put the burden on minority persons of color to come and teach us, we need to embrace as white people the opportunity and the privilege to go into racial ethnic communities and learn from them what their reality is. Too many times our churches say, well, we're open, we're willing to accept anyone that comes to us. Well, what the bishops are saying is that time needs to shift, and we need to be willing to leave our comfort zones and our safe sanctuaries to go out where people are and to get to know them. And while we're doing that, we need to live as people of relentless hope. We need to see the possibilities, not to live in shame of everything we've done wrong in the past, not to worry about all the harm, but we need reparations. We need to repent of what has been done before, but we can't go back and undo what has been done in the past. What we can do is work together to create a system that is truly equitable, just, and fair for all people. And then the willingness to be discomforted in order to be faithful witnesses, to say, I don't like hearing white supremacy, but I have to admit there's a lot of truth to it. I don't like the fact that we talk about white privilege and racism. These feel like judgmental things, but the truth is they're real. Racism, and we need to understand this, racism, the way we define it, especially around skin color, is uniquely US centric. That the way we have race relations and racial injustice in this country is very different. Globally, issues of tribalism, caste, and nationality are dividing. That's where the prejudice lies, but it's not uniquely around skin color, and the hierarchies are not so much to debase and dehumanize another person. So the hierarchies of violence are the universals. And US racism is a matrix. It's individual, and in our individual thinking, it's communal in how a community responds when strangers come in, when people of other languages, ethnicities, cultures, races come in. It's corporate and how we do business, as we have seen in our country in a number of ways, and systemic. So I want to just close by offering 3 resources that I have found to be incredibly provocative, incredibly insightful, that I think would be wonderful for congregations to study and discuss. First is Jamar Tisbis' The Color of Compromise, the truth about the American church's complicity with racism. This really talks a lot, not just about Methodism, but the whole span of not only how the church has contributed to, but in many ways stood back and allowed things to happen. The Cross and the Lynching Tree. James Cone is a Black theologian who really nails it and talks about the fact that the lynching tree and what was done to Black people in this country really has some strong parallels to what was done to Jesus in his own day. And then Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson, another that frames it in a larger context that helps explain, well, how did racism happen and get such a strong hold in American culture in a way that's unique and different from the rest of the world. So I went over my time and talked really fast. I'll stop sharing my screen and turn things back to Kathleen and see if there have been questions people would like Matt or I to address.
My question is Kathy still there? Or there she is.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you for doing that. So I'm going to start out with a couple of questions that I have and then move into the chat. And the first one's for you, Pastor Matt. So a lot of the books that I've read that talk about the Bible as supporting slavery is because of the teachings of Paul. They never really opposes it. And certainly the book of, is it Philemon, where he actually sends a slave back to his master. How do you kind of explain what Paul was thinking when he was doing some of that?
I'll answer it and then I'll let Dan make it correct. So one of the things we need to understand that Paul and others were expecting the second coming to happen right away. But secondly, the slavery, certainly the slavery the Jews had in Israel was as bad as slavery in American South. But the slavery some people chose to sell themselves into slavery. It was to get a job, to work for somebody. The slavery was not the same kind of slavery that we saw here in our country in the South. Dan, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would just build on that to say, especially in Israel, once the division of Israel and Judah and the 12 tribes, over time, there were, I loved when Matt talked about being a Greek geek, because I'm always in words and that cultural thing. In the Bible, the only difference between a slave and a servant was that a servant was from your own tribe, a slave was from another tribe. And the reality that I don't think we can even wrap our heads around is that someone might serve as a servant in their own, in someone else's home, go home, and they would have a slave. And it was for the survival of the whole culture that people who did not have a trade, who did not have employment, who were not able to work, say out in the fields or agriculturally or fishing, they still had to survive. And so it was a very different kind of experience in slavery and servanthood. And the very fact that Philemon exists, that Paul could write and say, receive this person back, not just as property, but as a brother, is actually fairly exceptional. And it has nothing to do with the American institution of slavery.
That's right. And that's where the sin comes in, because everyone that reads the Bible can twist the words to fit whatever their agenda is. And we had a long history of people justifying their expression of slavery, the horrors that it was, because the Bible said so.
Right. Andrea asks, our resolutions, this is probably more for Dan, but for both of you really, our resolutions seem very expansive, but how do we walk the talk?
Well, that's an excellent question. And while I want to say, I believe the book of resolutions has wonderful information in it. Information is not going to change our reality. Information is important. I recommended books, Matt has recommended books, but those books have to lead to action and a change of heart. And I believe relationships are where we're going to have to move. So many of our resolutions recommend training and policies and things like that. I think we're going to have to begin to move to a place where our laity and pastoral leadership are saying, there's a world out there that needs Jesus Christ. And that world right now is pretty different from our congregation. And that means that we're not just talking about race or ethnicity, we're talking languages, we're talking about education levels, we're talking about economic levels, we're talking about employment issues, we're talking about generational. I love talking to young people, but sometimes I don't know what they're saying because the generational differences are significant. We need to find ways to build bridges that move us to new places. And the Book of Resolutions can give us an idea of what we need to be doing, but we've got to get very creative on how to do it.
Okay. Sandy is asking, why are there so many local pastors who never mention issues like George Floyd's murder or even racism? Are they losing members? Or are they afraid of losing members? I'm not sure which.
We all love to preach to the choir because that brings in offerings. And I think I shared in my time that when I have spoken out and made people uncomfortable, I hear about it. But what's important to me is to not stop talking about it.
Yep. And I would just echo, I said, I think the shift that I've seen in my lifetime is when I started out, these were all seen as human rights issues. And they were really kind of, what does the gospel say about how we treat one another? Today, it's so hard to deal with anything Jesus taught, honestly and openly, without somebody getting upset politically, that we're making a political statement. And what I would love for us to be able to do in the church today is to say, we are first and foremost Christians seeking God's guidance in how we relate to one another. And secondarily, we're this party or that party, we're this position or that position. But I do think that preachers sometimes are very, very anxious about who they will offend. And that makes it very difficult to speak the truth in love and to speak truth to power. And then I think it's also what Matt said, preaching to the choir. I really feel our church is facing a major dilemma right now, because in order not to offend the people we already have, we're failing to speak a message that's attractive to the people outside.
So when I was an associate pastor, my senior pastor, who was the worst preacher I've ever heard in my life, it was painful, but he was the best pastor, the best leader, the most compassionate man I've ever met, and his congregation loved him. When he was a young associate, the bishop of the Baltimore-Washington Conference made a cross-cultural appointment and appointed an African-American man to serve this really well-established church just over the border in a very wealthy suburb of Maryland. And he was getting death threats, because this was right in the civil rights heyday. He would get death threats every single week. So every sermon he wrote, he wasn't preaching to the choir. Every sermon he wrote was, if these are the last words I ever say in my life, here's what I want them to be. And I think a lot of our pastors who are comfortable and who want to be peacekeepers don't have that attitude of speaking the truth to power.
Lucinda says, how do we go about developing interracial networks in our communities so that there is more of a genuine flow of concern and growth of beloved action?
Well, I think, Kathy, you and your group is doing a great job with something like this.
Yeah. And I would say in almost every community that I have worked with, there are already people that are doing this. And finding out who's already doing this, our United Methodist Church tends to be lagging a little bit behind. We're not on the cutting edge in these conversations and building these bridges, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations that are seeking dialogue and connection and partnership. And I personally feel the future of our church's future existence, survival, depends on whether we start building bridges into our communities that help us become more multiculturally competent, interculturally connected.
Good point. I'm just going to mention that Ruby mentions that in the chat that there's going to be a study done in May on the mass incarceration and criminalization of people of color. And she's got a site here that we'll pass along in the email that I sent out on Monday. V, I know you're on. If you could make a copy of this chat, I'd really appreciate it. Okay, the next question is from Sandy again. Why are there so many resolutions with no accountability, Dan, since you mentioned it?
I guess you could ask the question, why do we have a church with no accountability? And once again, I'm not meaning to be glib or too bleak, but the fact of the matter is, you know, I look back at in 2016, one of the things that was passed was almost unanimously that in the next quadrennium, sometime between 2016 and 2020, there would be a racial justice Sunday that we were going to celebrate across the United States denomination. It didn't happen. And so what do you do about that? There were a number of congregations that did it. I think a total of 180 congregations nationwide did a racial justice celebration service. We don't have accountability. If people don't do it, then we we just kind of turn our heads and say, well, we're so busy, we have so many other things to do. I think it's a very strong indication. We in the United Methodist Church have a bad habit of making 50 things a priority. And when you've got 50 priorities, you've got no priorities. And I think it shows what we truly care about and what we're truly committed to by what we actually do.
Wait,
I think
Dan, you talk about accountability, and yet you mentioned that because you have access to the bishops, you know for a fact that there are elders who are members of the KKK and the Proud Boys.
Right.
There's no accountability for them?
No, as I say, it's come 4 different times to 4 different general conferences to say that kind of connection should be a chargeable offense. We should be able to call for a surrender of a pastor's orders if they do that. And it has never passed at general conference. So our whole voting body has said, no, that's we shouldn't do that.
And yet, if someone's gay or lesbian, they are charged.
Yes. Yeah. So it's the priorities where we focus our time, and it is difficult. One of the things that I hope we can begin to do, if our denomination won't hold us accountable, can we begin to create some accountability structures within our annual conferences and within our local churches? I will say for Wisconsin right now, we have put together and our Black Methodists for Church Renewal, our Commission on Religion and Race, our Ethnic Local Church Concerns leadership, are coming together to form an anti-racism task force to really move things forward. And for the first time since I've been here 11 years in Wisconsin, our Commission on Religion and Race is really seeing accountability and holding the conference accountable to the decisions it makes as part of their role and responsibility. When we have people who will take both responsibility and authority and hold accountable, then I think there's a glimmer of hope that we can start to be better. But right now, we're kind of sliding along with not much accountability.
And is that because when you've got a general conference with a vote from all over the country that you're going to have enough people on the other side that are going to?
All over the world.
Yeah,
well, yes, all over the world.
It's the global.
Yeah.
Once again, that kind of racism in America doesn't translate the same way or get the same kind of support with our central conferences and our global partners.
Right. Okay, in the time we have left, so Willie's asking, it seems that Matt and Dan get it. What happened in your lives to help you get it?
Well, I'll start because I mentioned it in my speech. It's generational. It's passed down. My father grew up with Quaker roots, and people were people. Everyone was a person of worth.
Yep. For me, I have to say, I started out really early. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Indiana, and racism was pretty rampant where I was. But even as early as when I was in high school, I dated, at that time, she preferred to be called Afro-American. We don't say that way anymore, but it was not popular. And I really was on the receiving end of racism in that it just hit me very early on that this was wrong. And then I have had, this is part of my privilege. I've been able to travel this globe. I have been able to move in and out of a whole lot of parts of this country and this world. And I think that for me, one of the reasons I have no problem confessing white privilege is because of time I've spent in Mozambique and Nigeria and Haiti. One of the reasons why I realize that our church is completely out of touch is I have worked with people in the South Bronx and Harlem and out in the fields in Southern California and Texas. I've been with minority populations, and I've really had that wonderful opportunity to be with and immerse myself in people whose lives and experience are completely different from my own. If I had a magic wand, if I was king of the world, I would wish for every United Methodist that they would have 2 weeks living with a developing country community where they were the minority, where they were the odd language, where they would, not to punish, but to open eyes and open hearts, because our world is just amazing. And I have found some of the most power and joy and spirit in some of the most poor and marginalized people I have ever met. And it has changed my whole life.
Yeah, and I'm so pleased, grateful, really. My 2 millennial daughters, this inclusive spirit has been passed down, and they live it out, and they get upset, holy righteous anger, when they see racism, sexism, fear of gay and lesbian. I mean, they get upset. And so it is generational, but it only takes one generation to change the course either way, which is a scary thing if it goes the other way.
Right. Another question that we've gotten from V is, will failing to address equity make the church irrelevant over time?
Well, I guess I would just say again, I think our survival depends on us really becoming a truly intercultural community, open to everyone. Because I say the other side of that is it's about relationships. We have all the information we need. We have all the programs. We have been talking around these subjects for such a long time until we learn to stop talking about people and start talking with people, until we open not just our doors and our hearts and our minds, but our entire spirits to other people. Things aren't going to change. And the world is just passing us by right now. And all we have to give of the gospel, we're wasting because we're not engaging.
Yeah, let me go back to my millennial daughters. The whole white supremacy in the name of Christianity is just turning the whole millennial population away. These kids now, their Christianity has a flavor of Buddhism, a flavor of Hinduism, a flavor of Native American, because of the internet. It's great. So, but I think the key and the favorite thing that Dan said, my favorite thing Dan said was, how in the world did human rights issues become political issues? If we could just wave a magic wand, which we can't, it's going to take blood, sweat, and tears to get human rights issues back to being human rights issues instead of a political agenda. I think that's where we could really all move forward together.
Well, along those lines, is there a sense, there's a sense in many churches, I think, that churches shouldn't be political. They just shouldn't get involved in politics at all. And yet, if social justice issues essentially are political, then how do churches address social justice without getting political?
Well, I would say Jesus was awfully political in his critique of what was happening in his day and age. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, we preached about the temple, right? That was the lectionary text. That was a political act of defiance.
Yes.
Yeah, I would just jump on to say, Matt talked about the slave Bible and how the parts were excised out that people didn't want to deal with. If we go to our Hebrew and Christian scriptures and take out everything that's political, we'll have about 16 pages left that are going to make us feel really good about ourselves, but we won't know what Jesus taught or why the church continues to exist.
They call that the Swiss cheese gospel. Holes everywhere.
Yep.
Where did this whole thing about not being political come from? Why is that such a big part of so many church members that feel that that's something that the church shouldn't do?
We've had in our recent, I'm showing my age now. In the modern era, the Vietnam War did more to split our church on a topic other than slavery. And there were there were strong emotions that came, and we had a lot of pastors who preached one way or the other on the war. There were a lot of people who left the Methodist Church through that period of time. And then there's also another cultural and systemic issue that I think is kind of important. In 1956 in this country, there were 111 acknowledged different denominations, sects, faith communions across the United States. As of 2020, there are over 11,000 different choices. And many of those new denominations and many of our independent and evangelical churches that have formed actually around politics. And so there has been, politics has been that dividing wedge that that culturally everything has been politicized, and the way the news, 24-hour news cycles and news that align one direction or the other. As I said before, systems are designed for results, and we have designed a cultural system that politicizes everything. And instead of the church having a greater impact on politics have had a greater influence, I think, on the church.
Yeah, interesting. Listen, we're over time, so I'm going to, and although there are other questions, but we have to be true to our time. So first, I want to thank Pastors Matt and Dan for a really excellent discussion tonight. I'd add sobering, challenging as well. But I love the statement that you read earlier, Dan, that living with relentless hope, I think is crucial for us to move forward, or you can just kind of give up. I also want to thank everybody else on this call for joining us for one or more of the presentations during this series. We hope it's helped you understand the impact of racism on the opportunities and quality of life that's available to minority communities. And I'd say, although this series is ending, our work is not. We are already planning our next steps. Next week, we're going to send out a brief survey about the series and your interests. And we hope that you'll take a few minutes to complete it. So with that.
Kathy, I wanted to make a plug for the May 13th presentation. It's going to be a panel on environmental justice that Church and Society Committee is planning now.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, but I'll put it into the email that I send out on Monday as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So with that, have a good week. Have a very blessed Easter. And good night.
Thank you all.
Good night. Thanks.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.